Hello. So this is going to be the first um, lecture for Music 3, elements of music we're going to talk about. So our first question that we talk about is just the big question, which is what is music? And um, as I go through this, I want to just remind you that um, to look on the Moodle page, there's going to be companion materials that will have some terms and some links. Uh, as this video is going up live now, but I will go in afterwards and add that material. I'm not expecting anybody to be watching these live. That's not the point of being a subscriber to this. It's just, again, we talked about it being redundant to make sure that you get access to everything that you need to get it, um, and that you're notified about it from multiple angles. So the big question: what is music? This is a music curriculum, and it's worth making sure that you have your own answer to that question before we start entertaining what the other answers to this question might be. So, what I'd like you to do is pause this. Well, if you're watching live, you can't pause it, but I'm assuming you're not watching it live. I want you to take a moment to answer that question as substantially for yourself as you possibly can. What is music? And come up with a definition that satisfies you personally and also manages to include in the big Venn diagram of all different types of music that includes everything that you're either not familiar with, you don't like, or you question whether it actually is music, right? But other people might accept it. So that's a good question to be able to answer for yourself, even before you hear what I have to say about this. Um, this is one of those types of subjects that's a little bit subjective. There's not, we're not talking about an objective fact, like what is 2 plus 2. We're talking about something much simpler. Excuse me, my heater on. It's cold. So by the book, the general understanding of it, what is yours? Those are questions that I want you to entertain. So now I'm going to give you the textbook, so to speak, definition of it. So what is music? I'm going to give it. I'm going to read it to you here, and something to write down to take note of, and then we're going to dissect it a bit. Patterns or sequences of sound organized by humans that are somehow distinct from ordinary speech or everyday sonic occurrence. That's a mouthful. I'll say it one more time, but you can obviously rewind this and play it back at your heart's content. Patterns or sequences of sound organized by humans that are somehow distinct from ordinary speech or everyday sonic occurrence. So let's take that piece by piece. Patterns or sequences, right? That implies some level of repetition, some level of predictability or structure. Um, and of course, it implies also the sound part of it. It's easy to overlook that because everybody takes it for granted, but the sound has to be a part of it. Patterns. What is a pattern? It's something that has a repetition to it that is recognizable on some level, right? Or a sequence. If we were to kind of trace out the sound, we could make a shape or a gesture that is identifiable and reproducible. Sound. You're picking it up here. Right? Organized by humans, right? So this is to distinguish from, whale song, bird song, um, sounds of the cosmos. There's a piece of music, quote unquote, that's supposedly the oldest music in the universe, which is this um, star somewhere in the galaxy that supposedly vibrates at a B flat that's like 5 octaves below the range of human hearing or something like that. We're not talking about that sort of thing that can be kind of cleverly relabeled as music. We're talking about things that people have deliberately set out to call music and that are somehow distinct from ordinary speech or everyday sonic occurrence. And this is a very subjective aspect of this. what is everyday? What is ordinary speech? What is ordinary speech? What is ordinary speech? What is ordinary speech? I can loop that, and all of a sudden you can start to hear musicality and in the pitch of it, in the rhythm of it. There's a radio station I listen to on WNYC, New York City. The host, every time he comes back from a little sponsor break, and he's coming back to the show, he always says the name of his show in this certain rhythm and cadence that sounds like music. I don't think he necessarily cares to think of it that way, but you can pick up music within things that aren't specifically intending to be music at the moment. So then it turns into, well, who's calling it music? That's a discussion um, that we can have with each other. The key elements of that description, though: patterns, sound, humans, distinct. Right? Those are the words if you want to kind of underscore the four ingredients. This is to make the old school kind of West European dominant definition of music was things that music has to contain, and this is using vastly different language, and we can talk about why that is in a second. Melody, harmony, rhythm. That's it. By those definitions, you can imagine what types of things are not called music. And a lot of them involve music that is not written down, right? So it's automatically inferior. And so I'm not saying this, but I'm saying that this is the implication of that old-fashioned definition that was almost still in vogue when I was a student, which, 20 years ago, something like that, when I was in your place. That is an old-fashioned definition. It will describe sufficiently the music in your ballet class, the music that goes behind most big budget movies, Hollywood movies. But a lot of music that you would call quote unquote world music, and we're going to talk later about that definition, because all music is world music. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but world music is not a very appropriate and even scientifically accurate way to narrow down anything. But for example, West African, Indian Hindustani, folkloric music from South America, like by that old school kind of West European dominant definition, those things aren't called music. For example, in Hindustani music, there's no harmony. There's incidental moments where two different notes are happening at the same time, but that's not what is meant when people talk about harmony. They're talking about chords, chord progressions. Melody. Well, in a lot of, for example, let's take West African drumming. Where's the melody? Well, you could take an abstract version of it, but that's, again, we're talking about stuff you can write out on a treble clef staff and a bass clef staff. And then rhythm. Well, there's a lot of music that doesn't have the sense of pulse in it. A lot of it can be very effectively used for scoring modern dance, contemporary dance, where it's more soundscape type of thing. Does that have a rhythm? Well, yeah, in some ways, because things happen and then they stop happening and then they change. But we have to go to a little bit more of an inclusive definition so that we can start comparing things on their own terms, rather than defining one thing by the terms set forth from an entirely different culture. So I'm going to read that definition of music, my operating definition of music, one more time to contrast with the old school melody, harmony, rhythm. Again, I'm saying that is not what we want to use as an effective definition. The one I want to use is patterns or sequences of sound organized by humans, I'm underscoring the important terms, that are somehow distinct from ordinary speech or everyday sonic occurrence, right? So that's our definition. That's our operating definition. Now, sound, that word, there is a common synonym that has a negative connotation for it. Think about what I'm talking about. What's another word for sound that has kind of a negative connotation for it? Say it in your head, right? Normally people refer to it as noise, right? The difference between sound and noise is entirely subjective, right? Uh, your music can be your next door neighbor's noise, right? And vice versa. Your noise can be someone else's music, depending on, basically, it's, if I were to simplify it, are you in the mood to hear it at that moment? Is it a welcome sound or is it an unwelcome sound? And if any of you are familiar with the choreographer Merce Cunningham, then you might also be familiar with the composer, who's also a close friend and I think, I believe, a partner of Cunningham's, named John Cage. And one of the landmark pieces of music that John Cage composed was philosophically was very difficult for a lot of people to hear as music. A piece entitled 4:33. Fourth, in other words, 4 minutes 33 seconds. And this piece of music, and you can actually buy the sheet music for this, and you'll understand why that's humorous in a second. I mean, we have to be honest, like that there are certain things that can be considered, even as we're taking them artistically seriously, we can put ourselves in the shoes of other people who experienced them for the first time and said, "Oh, that's a little funny." 4:33, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, is a quote unquote piano piece. It's a one-page piece of music and a performance, and this is a piece of music that relies on live performance. It has to have an audience. Pianist walks out on stage. They sit down at the piano and they sit there in silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Now, the piece of music, the actual sheet music, actually will say tacit, meaning don't play, right? And normally a piece of sheet music that says tacit will be like, for example, in one movement of a Beethoven symphony, the trombone player will have a part that says tacit, meaning don't play, right? You don't play in this movement, but you play in the other ones, something like that. But this is an entire composition that says tacit, and the point of it is that the audience is then encouraged to hear any ambient sound that exists in the performance space as music. There's a famous kind of apocryphal story of a performance of this where at the end, at the conclusion of this 4 minutes and 33 seconds of ambient sound that the audience is taking in, as opposed to, something that the performer is solely responsible for producing. An audience, and the pianist presumably stands up, takes a bow, and there's applause or something, and in that moment, someone in the audience says something to the effect of, "I wasn't done listening." The idea behind this is that you take an amount of time and you assign it to be musical sound. So now the sounds that would otherwise be considered noise, someone coughing or sneezing in the audience, a fire truck going by outdoors or something like that. Someone, someone's cell phone, these days, this was well before cell phones, but when it was composed, but someone's cell phone, having a notification go off, someone unwrapping a little cough drop or something like that. People shifting in their seats, the air conditioning kicking on or turning off. All of those things can then be perceived as music. And what do people do? We look for patterns. Remember that part of the definition, patterns in sound. And so we listen for, do I know when this next sound is going to happen? Do those two things happen in opposition to each other? And it is as much a philosophical statement about what music is as it is an actual piece of music. And the idea, some much more traditional musicians as and artists, you might understand, like, someone who goes to the trouble of putting together a Broadway show would look at something like that and go, "What are you doing? Like, where's the effort in this?" It's not intended to be a Broadway show. Broadway is, its own entire other genre of art and um, audiovisual textures, things like that. But in this case, it's basically saying, I'm putting a frame, a veritable picture frame, a musical picture frame around this space. Anything inside this frame is going to be considered music. And I want you to listen to it as such. I want you to listen for the patterns. I want you to appreciate relationships. I want you to develop an expectation and see it through, right? And just like any other forms of art, sometimes expectations are met and sometimes they're not. But in this case, it's chance meeting of expectations or discarding of it. Basically, resetting how closely you listen. If you imagine you're being told to hear a certain amount of so-called silence as music, and you're trying to participate in this thought experiment, you're going to really listen differently than you ever listened to anything that was officially. I'm just grabbing a random piece of music next to me. This is official music. This is real music. So I don't have to be scrutinized as close because apparently the process of putting it on paper has made it approved for my listening. Well, not necessarily. Just because it's written down doesn't mean it's good. And just because it's not written down doesn't mean it's not good. Right. So those are some philosophies that are interesting to start to entertain as you listen to anything. And if you listen with that in mind, wow, all of a sudden, music can be a lot more enjoyable to listen to, a lot more rewarding, a lot more challenging in some ways, right? The old stuff, maybe you don't just take it for granted anymore. And the new stuff, maybe you're more open-minded to it. This idea of taking and assigning music to have meaning is basically it can also never be entirely separated from the context and the culture that it's in. 433 in a concert hall, people will give it respect. 433, if you're a busker in the subway, um, a street musician doesn't have the same sort of association with it. So it's a context and cultural thing that has um, those are elements that have to be considered. So the environment, basically, indoors concert hall, outdoor street musician, a club, uh, someone's living room, any any place has different associations that come along with it. Just skipping through my notes here. If you're out of the context, the musical context, it's like hearing a language that you don't speak. Um, so as we go forth in this class and listen to music from as many different contexts as I feel like I can pull in without losing some sort of thread of continuity in the class for it, I want you to remember that um, the music has, like, the context matters, the culture matters itself. Music, there's an expression, music is a universal language. Think about what that means. Right. And I think that people increasingly, are more hip to this than they used to be. Back in my day, for example, the idea of music being a universal language. Again, before you go on, take a moment, pause this, think about that. Is music a universal language? My understanding, my experience has been no, it is not a musical language. Music is used universally in different cultures, but my music in my culture doesn't mean the same thing to other people. It's not heard the same way, it's not taken in, it's not experienced the same way. The whole idea of music in a major key is happy, music is in a minor key is sad. That's not universal. That's a culturally acquired association we have to it. There's music that you and I can hear, being people who, for the most part, have spent most of our lives in Western civilization, that will have an entirely different effect on people who, for example, grew up in India, grew up in South America. Very, very different effect. So the idea of the music being a universal language, I want you to kind of keep that, don't take that fully in. I'm not saying you can't experience things from music. You should. You must, right? You wouldn't be at this point in your studies, in your career trajectory, if it didn't have some kind of effect on you. But what I am saying is that you can't assume it has the same effect on everybody. Great example. Music from different generations, even in this country, United States of America, affects people differently, right? That seems like, well, of course, right? When you hear a certain genre or artist and you love it, you know that it's not guaranteed that someone 40 years older than you is going to have the same experience. Now, let's also add, in addition to the difference of time, let's add geography, culture, history. All those things pile up. We all know that. But then we think like, well, that doesn't apply to this thing just because I really like it. No, it does. It still applies. There is yet another apocryphal story, and if you don't know what that word means, look it up. Right? It's a good word to know. It's fun. It's fun to have that in your back pocket as you're reading things, especially news that might be questionable in its origin. Apocryphal. Aporcyphal. I'll put it. You know what? I'll put it in the description. But there is I've used a couple times already uh, Indian musical culture, and I'm talking about classical Hindustani or Carnatic music. Hindustani, northern India, Carnatic, southern India. Um, but in either case, very different musical aesthetic from what we're used to in the West. And there was this story of a diplomat coming to this country from India, and someone here wanted to show him high culture in America, and so he took him to an orchestra concert. And afterwards, orchestra concert, this diplomat was asked, "Oh, what did you think? What was your favorite part of that concert?" And he said, "Oh, I like that first thing that I heard." They said, "Oh, the overture." In the typical order of orchestra concerts, you start with an orchestra. I'm sorry, an overture. Then there's a concerto, and then there's intermission, and then there's a symphony. That's like the tried and true format for classical music concerts. Um, that's obviously involving, but we're talking about 50 years ago. You could pretty much assume that would have been format, and I think the story comes from around that sort of time. So he said, "Oh, I like that first one," and the host was like, "Oh, you like the overture?" He said, "No, the part before that." And you can imagine, like, well, that there was no music before that. What was he talking about? This person from another culture had listened to the orchestra's tuning note and all the instruments calibrating their tuning note to each other, which we'll and I'll put a link in there so you can hear an example of an orchestra tuning. But his response was, "No, that's music." No one didn't tell me it wasn't music. He wasn't necessarily looking at a concert program. He was hearing something by people on stage. So there was a frame set up. Though everybody on stage is whatever they're doing, they're playing music, but our ears, we just tune that out because, okay, that's, that's musicians warming up, getting ready. I'm not going to pay any attention to it. Oh, now the concert started and there's a piece of music with a title and a composer next to it. Now I'm going to listen to that. And that's official music. That's had the stamp of approval on it. That's called music. Bam. If you want to impress somebody, myself at the top of that list, one of these days, choreograph a piece to musicians just tuning, just to entirely put that on its head. Um, because it will, take a while for it to unfold to a Western audience that, oh, that's the music. That's not just people warming up. It's, I'm sure a choreographer out there has done works that begin with dancers stretching, that sort of thing, or warming up themselves, and it turns into something. And it would be what I'm talking about is the musical equivalent of that, um, in there. So that's all to say that our definitions of music are not universal, right? That's just one little example of that. Environment. The environment of the music. Is it inside? Is it outside? What's the size of the room? Is there an occasion? Is it someone's um, solo recital, a musician's solo recital? Is it a DJ at a backyard pool party? Um, is it Carnegie Hall? Is it is it a new music stage that's a couple blocks away that has much smaller and is much more about cutting edge stuff, right? The occasion and the environment bring associations with it that will help to determine how am I supposed to be taking in music? What is music, right? Do the artists talk to the audience, or do they pretend the audience isn't there, right? How formal is it? Those are things that help determine how we're also supposed to experience it. From an acoustic perspective, what substances are in the space? Um, is it are there is like are you going to see, for example, like a high school marching band playing in a gymnasium, rehearsing inside where it's really echoey and everything's harsh and oppressive? Yeah, or is it a room with a lot of soft surfaces so that the sound doesn't bounce around? Those things affect how people take in music. They affect, for example, do you feel comfortable talking when the music is going on? Right. I think a lot of us have had the experience where you'll go to a performance where people are in the audience are talking and then other people are shushing. Now, you can imagine there are certain circumstances where that you will happen. A lot of it is like, I paid for this ticket. I'm the passive audience member. You know, everybody be quiet and shut up so that I can experience my music. And then there's, you go to a club, you go to any place, you go to a bar. And again, I'm speaking as if there's not a pandemic going on, because things will eventually get this way in some shape or form again. So you have to obviously pardon my oversight of that detail for the moment. But in those circumstances, you're not going to go shush people, right? So what are the other associate? What's our tolerance for quote unquote noise going on around the area? So the physical nature of the environment has a lot to do with how we take in music. The root of the music. Does it come from, if you trace things far back enough, where did a specific style of music come from? This is a relevant point, right? This is a factor in the environment of the music. So we just talked about the physical environment, kind of the social environment, but now almost the geographic environment that you're experiencing. uh, sorry, my screen is going a little crazy here. I'm going to make this a little bigger. Thank you for your patience, of course. So if you have music that's based around or originated in an urban environment, when you think urban, you think dense populations and a lot of diverse populations up against each other. And so as a result, just like sociologically, you have groups of friends that are much more diverse and less homogenous. You also have the same sorts of things happening with the music. So you end up getting a mixing of musical styles. So if we're talking about where do certain styles come from, and then of course what associations we have with those styles. Well, for example, the genre of jazz music. Now we're talking about there's a lot of sub genres, just like any other type of music that's been around long enough. We're talking about jazz in its kind of like basic American form. Well, jazz is uh, a style of music itself that came out of New Orleans. We could say that New Orleans, Louisiana, is the birthplace of jazz. And that was kind of a combination of ragtime music, early 20th century kind of European popular music, and music that had more of diaspora influence, African diaspora people in the blues, the field music from slave culture, and you had this natural mixing of those two things, and so you had rhythm and harmony. Those are terms I'm okay using in this context. They aren't the only terms that apply here, but you had rhythm and harmony, especially being mixed together in and melody, of course, in a potent way that helped create jazz. And that was only really going to happen in a place where you had a lot of people coming from different backgrounds coming up and working together and being near each other, right? That type of synergy. So jazz is a necessarily urban creation. And then, well, then you take that by itself, and then you mix it with let's go to cities with a larger Jewish population, and you get traditional uh, uh, Jewish music, tunes, um, and uh, and you mix that with jazz, and you get klezmer music, right? So that's a specific combination, again, that was only going to happen if you had this type of music over here and this type of music over here, and they start to work together. Uh, in New York City, you get jazz and you get Afro-Cuban music, and those two get put together, and you get salsa, right? That is a term, by the way, that some uh, musicians in that genre don't actually like. Um, they would prefer a little bit more traditional terms for it. But in general, because it's also a dance genre in general, that we can use the term salsa to understand it's a hybrid of a bit of jazz and a bit of Afro-Cuban music. See if you can think on for yourself, like, what are some other styles of music, specific styles of music, that can be traced back to a specific city, right? And chances are they're going to be a combination of a couple things. Now, what do I mean by a specific style? Well, pop, I remember I got into a discussion with a student a while ago, um, where they said, well, pop music is a combination of styles. Okay, what two styles create all pop music? It's a little too open, because, well, yeah, there are definitely artists within the very unspecific label of pop music. There are definitely artists that combine music from different sources, but can you make a generalization that applies to all pop music? No. So you have to get a little bit more specific when you go there. So that was urban music. What about non-urban? Well, music that comes from agrarian, like rural uh, communities, their music is going to have a different approach. It's not going to be a result necessarily of combining things. It's going to be the sources of the things that ended up being combined in the cities. Um, you have music that's a lot more closely linked to their environment and nature as opposed to the cultures that exist in that place. Um, you'll have, for example, if we talk about music that comes from Indonesia, you have this gamelan music. There's very, very hypnotic, um, tuned percussion instruments that are used for uh, Javanese and Balinese ceremonial and social occasions. And what's interesting is that Balinese, I believe it's Balinese, um, there's an aspect of the sound of their instruments that is specifically for the spirits. Um, they would hear, for example, you being dancers, you've all heard pianos for your ballet classes, for example, or maybe your modern classes as well, that have not been well maintained. And sometimes the even an individual note will have a bit of a sour quality to it. We hear it with our Western ears as being out of tune, but in this Balinese culture, they deliberately make their notes have that little bit of friction and tug, even within a single note, because it is a more pleasing sound, and that extra bit is, I believe, it's an acknowledgement of the ancestors. Uh, certain cultures that have djembe drumming is part of them in West Africa. They'll add these metallic shaker-like fins to the instruments. They're called sync-syncs. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not sure. If you know better, let me know. Um, but it's things that get inserted into the sides of the drum so that as the drum is being played, you get this extra sound to it, which is, again, it's a sound for the ancestors. The earthly sound, the drum sound itself, is for you and me, and this metallic kind of ghost of a sound around every note that's being played. I mean, you can kind of appreciate the kind of the metaphor there that's at work, is for the spirits. So the nature of the sound itself uh, has significance. Um, there's in the culture of Mexico. You see, I have a marimba behind me, behind this stack of papers as well, and you'll see it in other videos as well. But in the Mexican culture, where marimba it actually comes from, marimba is, if you're not sure what it is, think of a very large xylophone. Matter of fact, let me see if I can get you a better picture of it. Right, it's percussion wasteland behind me. You can see it a little bit. They have on the tubes that help to amplify the sound. They have a like a membrane that ends up producing a buzzing sound. So again, it's this kind of faint halo around the sound. So there's the main sound for you and me, that's the wood that produces the pitch that we can sing along to, and then there's this buzz, and again, it's the presence of the spirit. So with that in mind, the the music has symbolism built in, and it's nature, environment, spirituality. Not that urban music can't have that, but it is a common denominator when we're talking about music that comes from areas where there is more space and less people, as opposed to in the cities, more people, less space, right? Think about that. How much space you have around you can determine where your mind drifts to if you put yourself in those people's shoes. right? So urban versus agrarian, or farm-based agriculture. We can talk about different features in music that are able to be analyzed in their own way. Now, I listed a few of them before when I talked about the original definition of music, the kind of Western centric definition of melody, harmony, rhythm. Those are on the list. It's just that it is a incomplete list. There is more that we can analyze beyond those things. And what is really helpful, we can talk about music from first principles, but it's not as effective as if we're talking about, like, the subject of artificial intelligence. Like um, there's a book that I read somewhat recently called Superintelligence, which talks about the future of AI. I'm drawing a comparison here. Stay with me. And the author, you can imagine that it would be tempting to use metaphors of, people versus insects when we talk about superintelligence growing and getting more and more substantial. But this book talks entirely from first principles, meaning it doesn't use metaphor. It just talks about the idea it wants to talk about. And when you're talking about scientific things, that's fine. But when you're talking about artistic things, it actually is almost harmful, because the purpose of art is to not solve a problem. It's to acknowledge other things, but it's not to build a bridge or cure cancer in its overt nature, right? It might do those things in metaphorical ways. So if we're talking about uh, breaking music down into its components so that we can talk about each component and its effect and its value and its weight, its presence, then it's much more useful not to come from first principles, but to use a metaphor. And so what I like to do is use movies. Everybody here watches movies. Doesn't matter what kind. There are certain things that all movies, devices, and pathways to communication that all movies use. And because everybody, I feel, has some experience critiquing a movie to some degree, and talking with your friends, or just to yourself. I liked it. Here's why. I didn't like it. Here's why. That moment worked because of this, so on and so forth. We can import that whole structure over, and we can start talking about music in a way that will help make you feel a little bit more comfortable about asserting an opinion, defining your own opinion, and you can, like I said, import these other ways of examining an art form that you're already familiar with. And if we just use a little bit of abstraction, we can reappropriate them for the purposes of talking about them. So, movies. Now, for my purposes, for our purposes for this class, we're going to use the following 5, and I'll put these in the doc as well, the description of this video, so that you can kind of use this as a bullet point for your notes. But there are 5 elements within within movies that we can use for music, analyzing it, discussing it, separating it out, putting it in a centrifuge, so to speak, spinning it up. I can take out this part. I can take out this part. Story and narrative, right? That's an obvious one. Movies have a story. You can talk about whether it was cohesive or not. You can talk about whether it was obvious or not, entertaining or not. story. You know, point A to point B, how do we get there? Right? What's the journey? That's thing one. Thing two, mood and story type. Is this lighthearted? Is this is it going to be a tragedy or a comedy? Um, am I allowed to laugh at this? Um, am I supposed to take everything at face value, or am I encouraged to be a little bit more like, you know, questioning about how simple, for example, the emotions are, right? A common thing that I like to dispel is, the idea of just describing music as happy or sad. Well, geez, I mean, that's like, yeah, I guess if you're in fourth grade, we can reduce things that way. But especially if you're an artist, I would hope that you have a much greater degree of nuance that you're looking for, that you expect of yourself and of other things, so that you don't just call things happy or sad. When's the last time you called a movie a happy movie, right? And does that mean all happy movies are the same? No. It means that we have to define it a little bit further. We have to go and talk about it a little bit more in detail. Is it cheerful? Is it celebratory? Is it um, an innocent happiness? Is it a happiness that comes from old age? What is what type of happiness? What type of sadness? Is it grief? Is it regret? Those that gets a lot more at sadness than just saying I'm sad, right? So I want you to set the bar high when we start talking about mood and story type. Okay, so that was the second thing. First thing, story and narrative. Second thing, mood and story type. Third thing, pacing and editing. Does the scene in the movie, if we're talking again about storytelling and bringing these definitions over to music, does the scene in the movie feel like it's letting there be a lot of space? Is there a lot of activity? Is there a lot of fast cuts back and forth? One of the surefire ways to tell, I mean, just from listening to a movie when it was made, is how quickly uh, the the next sound comes in, how much silence is permitted to be in there, how, and then if you're just watching without listening, how fast does the camera cut, you know, and is it moving? Is the perspective moving versus not? It's a surefire way to know how old the music was. Anything basically pre Star Wars, pre Steven Spielberg, and like let's say the 1970s has a very palpable different pacing to it compared to things, especially popular fare that has come out afterwards. Um, and I would encourage you, watch, look at what like a good example is like watch the Godfather movies and the pacing of that, and how that affects your ability to be excitable. Um, but pacing and editing, right? How things are cut together, right, in a movie. That's thing number three. Thing number four, casting. Casting both as in this actor versus that actress and the size of the ensemble, right? Is it a movie? I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Ex Machina, but there's basically three people in that whole movie. Besides the opening scene, uh, there's three people in the entire movie. Um, you know, and then as the size of the cast shrinks or grows, how does that affect um, the audience member? How does that affect the message being told? So that's thing number four, casting. Thing number five is the cinematography and the costumes within a movie, right? There was a period of time, especially, I want to say maybe like 15, 20 years ago, where like just every movie just had like this blue tinge to it. Or not every movie, but I should say like a lot of action movies, things like that. I guess I gave away some of my movie preferences right there, like action movies. But the difference between what are you looking at in real life and what kind of colors are end up being favored. Um, and then the costumes, like in the character, like how does the dressing up of the presence on screen affect things, right? I would be very interested to know from you what you would, if as we go listen to music, like is there another aspect of this metaphor that could be further explored? But these 5 things: story and narrative, mood and story type, pacing and editing, casting, and cinematography and costumes. We're going to use those 5 things to talk about music in a way where we can start to draw comparisons that are more fair, because all music has ways to connect with all of those things. Whereas before, rhythm, melody, harmony, whatever order I said it, melody, harmony, rhythm, I guess that's the hierarchy we were supposed to think of it before. The violin player is the most important and the drummer is the least important. That's kind of the implication of that, is that it was always said in those orders. But in those contexts, we we can't compare all types of music, because not all types of music focus on them, right? But if we talk about story, narrative, mood, story type, pacing, editing, casting, cinematography, and costumes, we can talk, in metaphorically speaking, about all music and compare them to each other in a fair way that keeps us open-minded as much as possible. So now, these 5 things, what do they correspond to? All right, I've been talking about them for a while now, several minutes. We are 52 minutes into this live stream. This is like kind of the summary of the rest of this class. It's going to be right here. Story and narrative. What musical element is that? Melody. Right. So we're going to use some terms that you're familiar with and draw them into the musical side of things a little bit. Mood and story type. Harmony. So melody and harmony, those are terms that I've already used. Pacing and editing is rhythm and tempo, activity levels. Those are the 3 that I've already listed, but there's 2 more. And in the inclusion of these 2 more, and I'm doing them in this order because I want to go from familiar to, that makes sense. I haven't heard it used that, maybe I haven't heard that term, but that's just as valid. That's the idea behind this order. So casting, we can talk about musical texture and orchestration. Texture meaning how many things are going on at one time. Orchestration means within those things, what are they? An ensemble full of clarinet players versus a string orchestra. Those sorts of things. Or I'm sorry, an ensemble full of clarinet players versus one clarinet player. That's a better way of putting it. And then the last thing, cinematography and costumes, translates to sonic and musical timbre and production quality, right? So what types of things can we do acoustically to change the sound, right? For example, middle C on a piano, the C in the middle of a piano keyboard is going to sound different from middle C on a pipe organ in a church. It's going to sound different from middle C on a bell kit that a kid in middle school is getting to take percussion lessons. Those same note, but different sonic color. And then production quality has to do with, well, most of the music that you and I hear is not live. It's been electronically altered in some way. So those alterations, much like filters you get on Instagram or something like that, are going to shape your perception of it. So how and why are certain things done? What are their effects? So those are the 5 movie things brought into the musical, right? and we can talk about them that way. And so this class is going to end up taking each of those things by itself so that we can compare seemingly entirely unrelated types of music to each other. I think that we'll call it a day now. Just want to make sure I'm not leaving anything out at the very end so I don't have to create an extra video. What I'm also going to do is put some timestamps in this video description, go back through it so that you can go back and find things more easily. And you'll be able to cross coordinate with other parts that are in the Moodle material that accompanies this, the terms and the subjects, the kind of the title cards of this. But otherwise, that will do it for this one, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.